Good morning and welcome to Fridays with Frank, a lecture series sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Gary Wenske and I'm the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Frank Church Institute was established to honor the achievements and carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church. He delivered the first lecture on War or Peace, the American Role, at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like these are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, C. Frederick Cornforth, and Community Development, Inc. for underwriting this series on how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. Today's speakers will discuss Marc Johnson's new book, Tuesday Night Massacre: 4 Senate Elections and the Radicalization of the Republican Party, that includes a case study on Frank Church. Joining him is Rod Grammer, President of Idaho Business for Education and a member of the Board of Directors of the Frank Church Institute. Rod covered Frank Church and Cecil Andrus as a news executive with the Idaho Statesman and KTVB Television. He is also co-author of a biography of Frank Church, Fighting the Odds. Welcome to both of you. Let's begin with Rod.
Thank you, Gary, very much. Good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us here for Fridays with Frank. Our speaker today is Marc Johnson, whom many of you already know. Marc is a veteran broadcast journalist and communications crisis management consultant, and he served as press secretary and chief of staff for longest serving governor in Idaho history, Cecil Andrus. Marc is also the author of Political Hellraiser, The Life and Times of Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana. His writing appears regularly in Many Things Considered, and his column appears weekly in the Lewiston Tribune. Today's conversation is going to center on a new book that Marc just published this week called Tuesday Night Massacre: 4 Senate Elections and the Radicalization of the Republican Party. On a personal note, I will say that Marc and I have been friendly competitors when we were both journalists, and colleagues for more than 46 years. One other thing that we have in common is that as journalists, we both covered and participated in many of the events that Marc chronicled in his book, Tuesday Night Massacre. Marc Johnson, welcome to Fridays with Frank.
Good morning, Rod. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for doing this and letting me talk about the book with my oldest Idaho friend. And happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I have to tell all the listeners here, Marc and I are very good friends, still are, even though he lives on the beautiful northern Oregon coast now. And I just have to say to everyone that I have library book envy. Every time I'm on Zoom with Marc, I look at this beautiful library that he has, and I'm very envious of that. So, well, Marc, let's just jump right in. Tuesday Night Massacre. That is a scary and a very gripping title. How did you come about calling your book The Tuesday Night Massacre?
Well, Rod, it's a kind of a serendipitous story. I was early in the research on the book, and I came across a reference to an article in Maclean's magazine, the Newsweekly magazine in Canada, kind of the Newsweek of Canada. And I searched up that article, and the headline was Tuesday Night Massacre. This was before I'd even begun to think about a title for the book. And I thought, that might work. I subsequently started referring to the book as the Tuesday Night Massacre. And when I sent the final preliminary manuscript off to the publisher, they said, "Well, that's an interesting title." And it went through the usual peer review, university press review. And one of the reviewers, a wonderful guy, emeritus professor at Notre Dame, came back and he said, you really need a better, the title is great, but you really need a better subtitle. And he suggested the radicalization of the Republican Party, which I thought, well, maybe that's going a little too far, but I don't know, the last 4 years and the events of January 6th maybe caused me to think it's not an overstatement.
Well, your book focuses on 4 U.S. Senate races from 1980. You focus on the Senate race in Indiana with Birch Bayh,
Right.
Iowa with John Culver, South Dakota with George McGovern, and of course here in Idaho with Senator Frank Church. Why did you focus on these 4 Senate races as opposed to any other Senate races that were going on that year?
Simply because I wanted to tell the story of, in part, the story is about the rise of the independent expenditure campaign, which really became a national phenomenon in 1980. And these 4 races, the 4 that you mentioned and the 4 that I focus on, were the targets of the first real nationalized independent expenditure campaign. A group called NCPAC, who you will remember well, Rod, you wrote about it a lot in 1980, had actually formed in the mid-70s. And by 1978, they were really getting some traction on the conservative right. And they targeted a number of Democratic incumbents for defeat in 1980. Originally, they started out with 6 targets. Alan Cranston from California and Tom Eagleton from Missouri were initially on their list. They dropped off. My supposition is that Terry Dolan and his running mates had decided that they were probably not particularly vulnerable in that election year, and it turned out neither was vulnerable. So they concentrated on the 4 you mentioned. So I use that frame to tell the story of how these independent expenditure committees really have weaponized American politics.
Yeah, tell us about the root of NCPAC. Is very, very interesting, the pedigree of that. And tell us about, sort of like how it got started. And there's some really familiar names that are now legendary, even in our own time, who were involved in the creation of this. Can you tell us about how it started and who was behind it?
Well, they filed their papers with the Federal Elections Commission in 1975 with 3 principal founders, a fellow by the name of John Dolan, Terry Dolan, another guy by the name of Roger Stone, yes, that Roger Stone, and a fellow by the name of Charlie Black, who had been a top aide to North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. These were young, new right, very conservative political activists. They'd all been involved in the college Republican or young Republican movement, had worked on some campaigns as junior staffers, and they decided that an independent expenditure effort, a political action committee, would be one way that they could really become deeply involved in American politics. And they had a lot of encouragement, particularly from Helms. Charlie Black, I mentioned, had been a top aide to Helms. And Helms also brought to the effort his pollster, a fellow by the name of Arthur Finkelstein, who had worked on a number of Republican campaigns in the 60s and 70s, had been Helms's top pollster, and he brought Finkelstein to the game. The other key player in at the very beginning was Richard Viguerie, who is still around. Viguerie is sometimes referred to as the funding father of the new right. He was the mastermind behind the direct mail effort that NCPAC used to both deliver a scorching message about incumbent Democrats, but also to have that envelope inside with the letter that you could send back your check. That's how they raised their money. And they did raise, by the standards of the day, they raised a lot of money. By today's numbers, it sort of seems insignificant. We're talking a few $1 million in the 1980 cycle as compared to the kind of money that political action committees raise and spend today. But again, in 1980, it's a really new phenomenon. And these guys seized upon it as a vehicle to, I argue, really attempt to take over and eventually succeed in taking over the Republican Party.
Yeah, so before we get too much into their tactics, there was a very key Supreme Court decision that really gave birth to NCPAC and subsequently to a lot of the political action committees we're seeing today. Can you talk a little bit about that Supreme Court decision and why it's so important to this story?
Yeah, most folks in this session, Rod, will recognize Citizens United as a pivotal Supreme Court decision relating to campaign finance, decided in 2010. But the real foundational decision was decided in 1976 in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. The Federal Elections Commission was still a fairly new phenomenon in the early 1970s. The law had been passed in the early 70s, modified after Watergate. And one of the objectives of the federal campaign finance law was to provide some real sideboards on these independent campaign expenditures. The Buckley decision turned that upside down. And basically, the ruling began the process of equating spending political money with free speech, equating the two as being one and the same. The Buckley decisions essentially opened the floodgates for these political action committees to raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. They weren't constrained by limits on contributions. As long as they maintained separation between a candidate campaign and their activities, they could raise and spend unlimited amounts of money to support or to oppose a particular candidate. So that Buckley decision was critical. I could go deeper into that, but just say that's the foundational case that every single Supreme Court decision since has relied upon to further expand the power, in my judgment, the pernicious power of money in politics.
Marc, tell us about these four senators, a little bit about who they were for those who aren't that familiar with them, and talk a little bit about their accomplishments in the Senate so our listeners will really understand who these main players are in terms of the incumbent senators.
In 1980, Frank Church, George McGovern, Birch Bayh, and John Culver had a combined 66 years in the United States Senate. Culver was the junior member of the foursome. He was in his first term in 1980, running for re-election for the first time. Bayh was a third-term senator from Indiana. McGovern, a third-term senator from South Dakota. And of course, Senator Church, a four-term incumbent from Idaho, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Most folks in Idaho who pay attention to politics know the important role he played as an early opponent of the war in Vietnam, investigated the intelligence agencies in the 1970s. I argue in the book that it's the single most important investigation ever conducted by the United States Congress, including Watergate. Floor sponsor of the Wilderness Act. I could go on and on. Church had a remarkable level of legislative accomplishment, in addition to being chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, recognized expert on American foreign policy. McGovern, a prairie populist in many ways, very tuned in to agricultural issues, devoted a good part of his political life to trying to eradicate hunger as an issue, worked across the aisle with Bob Dole to create the food stamp program, among other things. A decorated combat World War II bomber pilot in Italy during the war. So, supremely accomplished guy, a PhD in history. Birch Bayh, elected at 28 to be the Speaker of the Indiana House of Representatives, and then go on to become a United States Senator. The author of 2 amendments to the United States Constitution. It's been said that Bayh wrote more of the Constitution than anyone other than the founding generation. Also the architect of Title IX, which was so important to women, opportunities for women in higher education. Particularly, we think of it in terms of athletics for women. Culver, again, the junior member of the group, but by the time he gets to the Senate in very short order, he's recognized as one of the experts in the Senate on national security policies, a member of the Armed Services Committee. He comes up with the idea of creating something which is now known as the Culver Commission, which examined the workings of the Senate, recommended the internal workings of the Senate, recommended a number of reforms that were adopted in that period. So these are remarkably accomplished individuals. I sort of characterize them, Rod, as the traditionalists in the book. The guys that challenged them in 1980s were the radicals. Church, McGovern, By, Culver, institutionalists about the Senate and its role in our politics. Fierce defenders of the Senate as a co-equal branch, a part of a co-equal branch of the federal government, willing to take on the presidents of their own parties, as McGovern and Church particularly did over Vietnam. So really accomplished guys. The opponents, on the other hand, had a very different view of politics, I think. They were going to Washington if they could get there to, as my old friend Marty Trillhouse used to say about many Republicans in the Idaho legislature, they want to put a rock on the no button. They want to be against things. They are bringing an idea that government exists to be cut down to size. You'll remember Steve Sims's slogan, "Take a bite out of government." I'm not sure that you could point to anything that he actually did that took a bite out of government, but it was a catchy slogan. So it's an entirely different way of looking at the job of being a United States Senator between these incumbents that are targeted by the new right and the guys who wind up replacing them.
So, Mark, these senators were obviously highly accomplished, had been reelected many times. At least two of them had run for president for the Democratic nomination. One of them was the Democratic nominee.
By also ran.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, I mean, they were really top-notch, veterans of the Senate, key players. And so why did NCPAC want to take these guys out? What was their motivation for targeting these four senators?
Simply because of that. They recognized, Terry Dolan recognized that Frank Church, McGovern, By, and Culver were among the most effective members of the Senate, arguably among the most effective liberals in the Senate. And they wanted to really knock that element of American politics down to size. And what better way to make a statement, an ideological statement, a political statement, than to knock off the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, to defeat a candidate who had been the Democratic standard bearer in 1972 in McGovern, defeat a guy who had been, in By's case, largely responsible for turning back two of Richard Nixon's appointees to the Supreme Court. So these guys are really liberal icons of the Senate, and NCPAC wants to make an example of them. So, beyond the specifics of the four campaigns, Dolan had a real motive, objective. As I said at the outset, I think he really set out to remake the messaging of the Republican Party and, in essence, to take it over, to bring this kind of new right politics of anger, grievance, fear, being anti-elitist, bring that to the fore in Republican politics. And that's why I think the election was so important to what's happened in the intervening 40 years, because that really is where the Republican Party is today. It is a party mostly of grievance, anger, fear, playing on people's emotion. And Dolan figured that out early on with the help of Viguerie and Arthur Finkelstein. Finkelstein's a key player in this because, and one of the things that's happening in 1980 that is kind of further illustrates it as a hinge point in politics, is that public opinion polling is really getting sophisticated. And think about it, this is the pre-cell phone days. Now people are very reluctant to respond to pollsters. It's hard to get a good sample. We've seen that in the last few election cycles, with polling being largely discredited in many ways as a way of understanding public attitudes. But in 1980, it was pretty easy to get a good sample. You could call people on their landline at home and get them to respond to a lengthy questionnaire. And Finkelstein was very, very good at probing people's emotions, these points at which they could be angered by an issue, by a slogan. somebody said that he could look at a poll and see emotion. And, fear is a great motivator, maybe the greatest motivator in politics. These guys were playing the fear card.
So the polling was really clear. What Finkelstein saw was that there was this pent up fear and anger and rage in the public, and they were sort of loaded for bear already. And then Nick Pack just came in and took advantage of that. So
yeah, I think that's a fair statement. And then I think the other element that is working to their advantage is they're able to support and in many respects recruit the challengers against Church, McGovern, By, and Culver. Steve Sims, for example, a darling really of the new right. He'd been deeply embedded in these groups. You documented it in your reporting, Rod, in 1980, which I rely upon to a fairly well in the chapter about the Idaho campaign. He's deeply embedded with these new right groups that are all forming up in the late 1970s. The Heritage Society, the Heritage Foundation, I should say, the American Conservative Union, the Conservative Caucus, all of these groups that are coming together pretty much with the same agenda, which is to help the Republican Party become more of an ideological party. Nick Pack really is the tip of the spear. They're kind of the quarterback on these efforts. But they needed candidates to fit the image of the new right candidate. Steve Sims was clearly that. Dan Quayle was clearly that in Indiana. Handsome, good-looking, glib guy, much like Steve Sims. You remember how good a campaigner Sims was, Rod.
oh yeah.
Backslapper, a hail fellow, well met, big smile, never met a stranger, wade into a crowd, all that sort of thing. Great retail politician. Chuck Grassley was like that in Iowa. And certainly, to a lesser degree, Jim Abner, who was the challenger to George McGovern in South Dakota, but a different kind of Republican candidate, not an old school sort of country club Republican, but somebody that, was really, really ideological, could turn a phrase, make an outrageous statement and make it sound like it was, a brilliant insight into politics.
So it's not too far-fetched to say that Dolan and Viguerie and Helms and all these guys, they weren't just trying to bring down the Democrats or these liberal senators. They were trying to actually bring down the Republican Party as it had been known for years and years and years. And they really were denigrated the so-called traditional Republicans like, Everett Dirksen and those kind of people as country club, navel gazers really than anything. This was an attack on the Republican Party as much as it was on the Democrats.
It very much was. In fact, Dolan and these guys, Viguerie, were incensed by the fact that Gerald Ford became president. They thought Ford was just a squishy moderate, not nearly conservative enough. And they went absolutely ballistic when he appointed Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. Rockefeller, the absolute epitome of the New England liberal East Coast Republican elite in their minds. And they were absolutely incensed by that. And they were determined that they were going to champion a different kind of Republican candidate. And Dolan was very open about it. One of the reasons he got so much attention, as you know, Rod, as a reporter, he was great copy. He could turn a line. He could make the outrageous statement with a smile on his face, and reporters absolutely lapped it up. But he was very candid in saying, yeah, I want to get rid of the moderates in the party. Any party that has Jacob Javits and a Strom Thurmond, he says, is not worth anything. We got to get rid of these moderates. We want to get rid of the Jacob Javits. We want to get rid of the Mac Mathiases. We want to get rid of the Bob Packwoods, get them out of the party and bring in a whole new cadre of these new right activists.
So this is really the start of what we now know as rhinos, Republicans in name only.
Yeah, exactly.
And not to digress, but the irony is that some of the main characters that played a role in the 1980 Senate race here in Idaho are now called rhinos in their own party.
That's absolutely right. And which tells you how far the Republican Party has moved away from even what we thought of as maybe probably pretty right of center politics in 1980, how much further to the right it has moved, at least at the state level, in most states now. I mean, it's hard not to say that this has been a radicalized party. And I think you can trace the roots of that to 1980. And then the subsequent events, Newt Gingrich arrives on the scene right about this same time, gets elected to Congress in 1978 with support from NCPAC. He'd attended their campaign schools. I write in my book that I think he actually adopted Terry Dolan's language in order to get himself elected to the Congress from Georgia in 1978. And he becomes increasingly more bombastic, increasingly more using this increasingly radicalized language of the Republican Party until he winds up being Speaker of the House after the 1994 election. So a lot of pundits now say, well, it all began with Gingrich. Well, no, it goes back farther than that.
So, Marc, you've laid the table really well for 1980, who the players are. Let's talk a little bit about NCPAC's tactics. And you're right, I interviewed Terry Dolan in his office in Washington, D.C., and he was very colorful quotes. And one quote he had, which was, we got to get started early on this because it's going to be the fourth quarter before you know it.
Right.
And I always thought that one of the really brilliant strategies, tactics they used was starting really early. Can you talk a little bit about that early start and maybe talk about how it manifested itself in these four races, and maybe Church in particular, since a lot of our audience members are from Idaho?
Yeah, that was absolutely a key component of their strategy to begin, because they knew from their own polling, and just anecdotally, I'm sure, they knew that all four of these guys were actually in pretty good shape politically heading into their reelection in 1980. So in order to get into a position where you have a competitive campaign, they had to begin to systematically redefine the incumbents. And the way they did that was to start very, very early in 1979 in every case. Dan Quayle in Indiana announced for the Senate early in 1979, 18 or 20 months before the election. And NCPAC was right there helping spread this sort of anger message in the population and the electorate. And they certainly were doing that in Idaho. So they needed to drag down the approval ratings of these guys to get into a position where once the campaign really began in earnest, which is typically, after the 4th of July in an election year, campaigns really begin to take on momentum. They wanted to be within striking distance of these incumbents. And the only way to do that was to attack their character, to go after them as individuals, to suggest that they were somehow un-American, that they weren't patriotic enough, that they were anti-family, that they were a threat to national security. An absolutely ludicrous claim to make against a Frank Church or a George McGovern, both of whom were decorated veterans of the Second World War, people who devoted their life to issues related to the national security and the best interest of the country. But to make that claim and to make it over and over and over again in newspaper ads, in television commercials, in direct mail particularly, because Viguerie was, very astute about using that direct mail. It was not just a fundraising mechanism, although that was a big part of it. It was a way to deliver a message and deliver a message over and over and over again. So starting early was absolutely critical because they had to drag down the approval ratings to get those guys into a position where they could be beaten.
Well, we've always had negative campaigning in American politics since the beginning. But this seemed to be the start of what at least I call now the politics of personal destruction, where you don't just attack people on their votes or their issues. You go after them to destroy their reputation. Do you think that's what NCPAC was trying to do in this case?
Yeah, no question about it. Well, Dolan was, again, he was extremely candid about saying publicly, saying the quiet part out loud, as they say. He said, we're going to have people voting against Frank Church and they won't even know why they're voting against him. And that was the whole part of their strategy, was to find a way to denigrate the character of these guys, drag them down, raise questions in people's minds about, were these guys really what they appeared to be? And, one of the benefits, Rod, you'll appreciate this, of being able to go back 40 years is to get into the archives of these four senators and, at least in a couple of cases, the people who defeated them, and look at the material that the campaigns had access to at the time. And you realize that how effective these messages were in denigrating the popularity of Senator Church and these other incumbents. So it's a time-tested technique. What NCPAC did was to start it early, to be separated enough from the Republican candidates that the Republicans had the benefit of being able to disavow. All of these Republicans said, well, that's not me. That's not my campaign. I'm not running that kind of a campaign. But at the same time, they're benefiting enormously from the fact that these attacks are taking place.
Mark, there also seems to have been in 1980, 79, 80, a confluence of events and a climate that was fertile ground for this kind of a negative, fear-based campaigning on NCPAC. And that was that, we had the Iranian hostage crisis, we had high oil, gas prices, we had high inflation, we had a lot of prickly issues like the Panama Canal. We had, an unpopular Democratic president. Just touch base on that. The climate at the time just didn't seem very conducive to these four senators running for re-election.
Well, again, and Dolan was good at many things. And he was good at picking his spots, picking his timing. And you're absolutely right. 1980 was a really difficult year to be a Democrat. I mean, Democrats lost 12 seats in the Senate, and NCPAC was involved in, only a handful of those really in any meaningful way. So it was a very tough year to be a Democrat, but it was a really great year to make a statement about the fact that this kind of politics could be successful. And that's part of what Dolan and his cohort wanted to do. They wanted to, as I said earlier, they wanted to take over the messaging of the Republican Party and, in essence, take over the party. And they succeeded. So the climate was right in many respects, as you suggest, with an unpopular Democratic incumbent, the Iranian hostage crisis, the bad taste in many people's mouth left over from the Panama Canal Treaty debates. A whole host of issues were cutting against Democrats in 1980. And Dolan was smart enough to realize this would be a great moment to pounce.
There also seemed to be a very influential person running for president on the Republican side that particular year. Touch on the role that Ronald Reagan played in 80 in these Senate races and the entire messaging and all that.
Yeah, well, I think, again, NCPAC spent most of the money it raised in 1980 supporting Reagan's campaign. Mostly in southern states where they thought Jimmy Carter might be able to win. So they were deeply involved in the Reagan campaign. And a lot of these guys were veterans of having worked on Reagan's earlier campaign against Gerald Ford in 1976. And Dolan and Roger Stone and these guys came out of that campaign thinking, we need a different kind of Republican, and Reagan was clearly their guy. So he represents, in many respects, I think, as much as he is lionized by some on the conservative right, he still represents this kind of cutting edge of a new kind of American politician, even though he's been around on the scene for a long time by 1980. But he was a right guy at the right time to take advantage of this environment, and NCPAC recognized that as well. The irony here, though, is, Rod, after Reagan gets elected, some of the wiser heads in the Republican Party, more mainstream Republican leaders are saying, this is a real danger to the party that we have these loose cannons rolling around on the deck out here in the form of these independent expenditure campaigns, and NICPAC in particular. There's a famous meeting that I recount in the book where Richard Richards, who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, a strong Reagan supporter from Utah, convened a meeting of all of these new right activists, including Dolan and Vigory. And he basically says to them, I'm not going to let you take over the Republican Party. And the answer he gets back from them is, too late, we already have. And so they become increasingly disenchanted of all things with Reagan. They don't like the fact that he brings James Baker into his administration, too moderate. They don't like the fact that George Shultz is part of the administration, too moderate. And they really want to get rid of the moderate elements in the party. So we're seeing that again unfolding right now with the attacks on Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and others who have broken with Donald Trump. So it's a pattern over the last 40 years.
So Mark, let's talk about the Frank Church, Steve Sims race as kind of a microcosm of NICPAC and all this. There was Terry Dolan found a good foot soldier here in Idaho who had actually already started working on an effort to defeat Church. There was a group called Anybody But Church, ABC, as you recall, and there was a very colorful character who was behind that effort, who ended up, becoming sort of the chief point person for Terry Dolan here in Idaho. Tell us about ABC and its role in this.
Yeah, ABC was started by a guy named Don Todd, who had been executive director of the state Republican Party, had worked, I believe back in the day, worked for Wayne Kidwell for a while when Kidwell was attorney general, and had managed Alan Larson's unsuccessful gubernatorial campaign against John Evans in 1978. So he's literally out of a job. He's looking for a way to stay involved in politics. And he told me quite candidly when I interviewed him for the book that he seized on the idea that Alan Larson had been sort of victimized in his campaign by, Rod, you'll remember Alan Larson going on the old Viewpoint program.
I was on Viewpoint that night. Yeah.
And being asked a question as to whether it was possible to legislate morality. And Alan Larson, a good LDS bishop, said, yes, it is. It is possible to legislate morality. And he carried around that millstone around his neck for the rest of the campaign and was vilified for it and lost in a landslide to John Evans. So Don Todd says, well, if they could do that to Alan Larson, why can't we do that to Frank Church? So he set out to create a counterpoint to Church's reelection campaign, perhaps not even really fully aware of what was going on with NICPAC, because he told me that NICPAC called him sort of out of the blue and said, we understand you're running this effort. Why don't we go into cahoots with each other? And eventually, shortly thereafter, NICPAC starts paying the bills for Don Todd. They pay the rent, the insurance on his equipment, but he does become the point man in Idaho and is in the press all the time during that late 1979 and all the way through 1980. And it appears in television commercials. The closing commercial, as he tells it at least, in the campaign that they paid for, was him looking directly into the camera and saying, the Panama Canal was ours, Frank Church gave it away. That's what this election is about.
So tell us a little bit about Don Todd's very first commercial against Church, because I think it sort of sets the stage for the entire tactics that NICPAC and ABC used against Church. The very first TV commercial, and I think it was in July of 1979, if I'm not mistaken, the summer of 79.
That's right. The scene is in front of one of the abandoned Titan missile silos out in Owyhee County, southwest Idaho. And a state legislator, Republican state legislator by the name of Jim Golder, is the on-camera presence. And he looks into the camera and basically says, these missile silos are empty because Senator Frank Church is wrong on national defense. and we've got to get him out of there if the nation wants to be secure. The prop was totally wrong in that the Titan missile silos had been abandoned some years earlier because the Air Force was upgrading its missiles to the Minuteman system and had relocated missile sites around the country. So the silos were empty. It had nothing to do with Church. In fact, he had supported the Minuteman missile program, but it left the impression that somehow this guy was soft on national security, weak on national defense. How many times have you heard that as an allegation against Democrats ever since? So I asked Todd about that, and he said that he had once received a really good piece of advice from Stuart Spencer, who was a guru for Ronald Reagan's campaigns as governor in California. And Stuart Spencer had told him, when you take on an incumbent, the first ad you run against them ought to have a mistake in it. It ought to be something that's just a little bit wrong, because that sets off the dialogue. That sets off the controversy, which is what they want. They want the charge to be repeated over and over again as you try to refute the charge. So it's really a vicious cycle, brilliant psychology, I guess, but really underhanded politics. So he freely admitted that they set out, to make it just a little bit wrong, leave the wrong impression. And he said, here I am, a nobody, and the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is arguing with me about a television spot.
So that led to what Senator Church, many things subsequent to that in the campaign were basically exaggerations, which led Church to say, he was being attacked. It was the big lie technique, or basically it set the stage for the whole campaign.
That's exactly the terminology he used, the big lie. These guys are practicing the big lie. They say a lie over and over enough that people start to believe it. And it became very, very difficult to refute. And even when Church used that characterization, referencing, Adolf Hitler's technique of telling, don't tell a small lie, tell a really big lie, because it'll have more impact. It'll go over bigger in a bigger way. So Don Todd and his guys come back at Church and say, well, you're accusing me of being a Nazi. You're accusing me of using Nazi techniques. So it's a kind of a lose-lose situation. The oldest rule in politics is you let no charge go unanswered like that. Well, the problem is when you're trying to answer sort of a faceless, nameless committee based in Arlington, Virginia, that's pumping money into the political bloodstream of Idaho to defeat you, it's much different than facing off against your opponent or somebody that you can identify as having really made the substantive charge. And so it's a really difficult thing to respond to. And frankly, none of the campaigns did a particularly good job of responding. And I have real sympathy for them because it's just darn hard to respond. I quote Birch Bayh in the book, for example, as saying it's very difficult to get a message out about how you're trying to help Indiana farmers with ethanol when you're being accused of being a baby killer, which was also a charge that was leveled against Church. Completely, totally ludicrous, unfair, didn't comport with his record in any way, but the charge was made.
Yeah, I want to touch on that just for a second, Mark, the abortion issue, because this was almost a personal one for me. I came out of church on Sunday morning and went to the parking lot, and there was a pamphlet on my windshield accusing Frank Church of being a baby killer. So can you talk about the role of a couple issues that I always thought were pretty important in this election? One was that Sunday morning massacre, to borrow a phrase, and then the Panama Canal treaties.
Yeah, well, the abortion issue was used against each of these four incumbents in almost precisely the same way. Their records were distorted. Evangelical Christian groups in every state and the Catholic Church, particularly in folks with the Catholic faith in South Dakota, which had a very large population of Catholic voters.
And Idaho.
Really used this leafleting technique very successfully and made no bones about it. They were going to be out there making this the decisive issue And it probably was the decisive issue in the South Dakota race in many ways, because McGovern's position on that issue, frankly, was more in line with what we think of as a Democratic liberal position on abortion or pro-choice issues now. Church's was not. His position was very much similar to what C. Sanders's position always was, which was essentially to echo the LDS Church position. Abortion is only acceptable in the case of rape, incest, or where the life of the mother is threatened. But they distorted his record by attacking him because he refused to endorse a constitutional amendment to outlaw abortion, and somehow that translated him into being a baby killer. So that was a powerful issue. The other one you mentioned is the Panama Canal. Canal treaties passed in 1978 with overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate. Church is the floor sponsor. I think fully aware of the fact that it's going to put him in political peril at home. But to his undying credit and to his personal integrity, he did what he thought was right in the national interest, but he got totally beat up for it, as did these other guys. The irony, of course, is 40 years on, we don't have tens of thousands of U.S. military personnel in Panama anymore simply to protect the canal. The canal has been expanded and upgraded under Panamanian sovereignty. It has not been an issue of falling into, under foreign control or communist influence, as the charge was made in the late 1970s and in the 80 campaign. Panama has pretty good relationship with the United States, just as Church predicted it would. It's played out just exactly the way he predicted it in Senate debate.
Yeah, I might also add that I know a lot of military veterans from the United States are actually retiring in Panama because it's such a great place to retire, which is a great irony looking back at the 1980 race. So let's talk a little bit about Steve Sims. So when we were reporting on this, I think we all believed that there was collusion or some collusion between the Sims campaign and Nick Pack and the far right. But obviously could never prove it. So what did your research discover? Are you any closer to that question, whether there was actual collusion there?
I can't say that I'm any closer to a conclusion about it or a smoking gun, if you will, about it in the Idaho race, although the circumstantial evidence is pretty overwhelming. The fact of the matter is it's pretty easy to cover your tracks in this regard. But there are no no coincidence in politics. So the fact that the ABC effort is being run by a guy like Don Todd, who has deep relationships within Republican circles in Idaho. Same thing happens in Indiana. Same thing happens in South Dakota. So the same thing happens in Iowa, where you have Republican operatives who are deeply embedded in the state's Republican politics suddenly wind up being the point men for these independent expenditure campaigns. And it's almost as though they don't really need to, write memos back and forth to each other. They can merely track what each other is saying in the public press and construct their strategy in accordance with what they're seeing and observing. But it sort of stretches credulity, I think, to say that there was not collusion at some pretty significant level in a couple of these races. South Dakota is the most obvious one, where the South Dakota Democratic Party actually made a complaint to the Federal Election Commission during the campaign, alleging that Nick Pack had improperly provided polling information, financial support to George McGovern's opponent, which Jim Abner denied. But read the book and see if you come to the same conclusion that I do, that it just doesn't pass the smell test, that there was not coordination. The FEC staff, by the way, wrote a scathing report about this, saying there was no evidence, there was no way that they were able to disprove that this coordination had taken place. And Abner didn't even really try to disprove it, other than to say, I wouldn't do that. And for whatever reason, and I haven't been able to really pin it down, the FEC, the commissioners of the FEC, did not follow through on the complaint and issue any sanction against Abner's campaign, although the paper trail is clear.
So, Mark, on election night, Tuesday night in November 1980, the night of the massacre, all four of these senators lost their races. But one curious thing that I thought was interesting in your book was that Frank Church lost the race. The other ones lost by pretty good margins. But Frank Church lost by less than 1% of the vote. Why the difference? Why did Church, relatively speaking, do better than Culver, McGovern, and By that night?
Well, it sort of relates to the conversation we had before you joined us with prior to this about the good constituent service and staff work that Church always enjoyed and benefited from and insisted upon. I think he was, a terrific constituent service politician, and almost everybody in the state had some record or some incident where they could say, I went to Church's office on X, Y, and Z, and they helped me navigate through my Social Security benefits or whatever it might be. So he was in very good shape from the standpoint of taking care of Idaho issues. I remember a big issue at that time was getting appropriations to improve American Falls Dam in eastern Idaho. And Church was all over issues like that. So he was a good, blocking and tackling constituent service politician. And I think, he had a stellar reputation. It took that extended campaign to tarnish that reputation and to attack his character. And it's a testament to how deep and broad his support had been in previous elections that he came as close to surviving in this Reagan landslide as he did.
All of us have views on why Church lost. I have my views. We've been debating it for decades now. What were the reasons Church lost, besides the fact that Nick Pack destroyed his reputation? What do you think were the pivotal issues that led to Church's defeat ultimately, and events, one in particular?
Well, I think Nick Pack's campaign, and I don't make the claim in the book that Nick Pack single-handedly took down any of these guys. I think it was a complex series of factors that contributed to their defeats. What Nick Pack did was, at the margins, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 points of standing, influenced these elections. So they eroded the favorability by that much in order to allow a guy like Steve Sims or Chuck Grassley in Iowa to capitalize on that. And then you had just this cavalcade of negative issues that I put in the category of being issues that are purely emotional and grievance driven, issues that you can whip up people's anger about. So Panama was that, abortion was that. The issue of the bailout of New York City. New York City was in financial trouble, and Congress approved a bailout package. And suddenly that became an argument against folks in the Middle West and Idaho, Church in particular, who had supported, providing financial bailout of financial support for the city of New York. So there was all of these issues were grievance driven. They were driven by a general. Carter even recognized it, I think, in his own campaign, that there was he's been accused of giving his malaise speech, which he never used the word malaise, but that he was giving voice to this sort of undercurrent of anger and discontent that was in the country. And Nick Pack certainly saw that. I think that was the brilliance of Arthur Finkelstein's polling, that he was able to identify how to weaponize those issues to bring that grievance out. One thing I have to say too, and this again I think relates to the modern day phenomenon of the the absolute hardcore Donald Trump supporters on the right. A lot of these folks that were mobilized by Nick Pack's efforts and the efforts of the Moral Majority and Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum and other groups that were all part of this new right cohort, they were really mobilized by this desire to play upon this fear and grievance, and to target what they frequently referred to as low information voters, people who were not really terribly engaged in the political process, but people who could be persuaded by an emotional message around a key set of issues. So again, not to be disparaging of all Donald Trump supporters by any means, but there is a cohort in that group that really depends for information about politics and public life on a very narrow band of information sources from Fox News or Breitbart or wherever it might be. And almost all of that information is driven by that same kind of grievance, fear, animosity about the future, concern about the future of the country. So that's another phenomenon that I think you can trace over time back to these 1980 races.
So, Marc, you make, I think, a very compelling case, credible case, and actually it's a little bit of the theme of your book, that the politics of 2020, politics of 2021, for that matter, have their root in that 1980 campaign. And what's happened over the last 40 years really started in 1980. Can you explain that thesis, that sort of point of view that you have in your book?
You know, the radicalization issue, I was trying to think of a good current example to talk about in response to just that kind of question. So the last couple of days, I've been collecting quotes from Republican elected officials. And these are quotes from Ted Cruz, Senator Daines from Montana, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, and Matt Gaetz, the very Trumpy Republican congressman from Florida. Matt Gaetz recently went to Wyoming to say he was going to oppose Liz Cheney because she had voted in favor of Donald Trump's impeachment. So he stands on the steps of the state capitol in Wyoming and says, I list Mitch McConnell right along with the establishment figures like Joe Biden and Liz Cheney and Nancy Pelosi and Mitt Romney, who want to return our government to the default setting of screwing the American people to their benefit. That's right out of Terry Dolan's language and playbook. Kennedy, a couple of days ago, speaking about his opposition to President Biden's appointment for the Office of Management and Budget Head, he called her a whack job, a neo-socialist left of Lenin whack job. Daines said of the Native American congresswoman from New Mexico, who's been nominated to be Interior Secretary, she's a hardline ideologue with radical views out of touch of Montana. Ted Cruz said about Javier Becerra, who's been nominated by President Biden to be the head of Health and Human Services, a long-term member of Congress and the Attorney General of California. He's been palling around with Fidel Castro. He's opposed to free and fair elections. So it's not, the radicalization is not so much policy driven. It's driven by this politics of performance, if you will. How to get on TV, how to make a statement, how to drive a grievance, how to whip up fear among people and animosity toward the other political party. So if there's, that's as good an example, I think, as I have. All of those quotes coming with just in the last few days from people who are supposedly leaders of the Republican Party today, not talking about substance, not talking about policy, not offering an alternative to what President Biden has said, for example, with regard to economic relief during the pandemic, but attacking people on the basis of them being, palling around with Castro. Well, that's exactly the same thing that was said about Frank Church and George McGovern.
I might add that we're seeing that already in Idaho politics and national politics, where suddenly Republicans are bringing the S word out of the closet, out of the gutter.
Yep.
And it's not that we have policy disagreements, it's that you are an S, you're a socialist. You practice socialism, of course, which is always that threadbare but red herring that they drag out of the gutter whenever they want to attack somebody.
Yeah,
when they don't have anything better to offer.
Right. When Dolan was going after Frank Church, he was not really going after specific issues per se. He was going after demonizing somebody. You want to discredit your opponent. You want to make them illegitimate in the eyes of the voters. And that's the kind of politics that increasingly has dominated the Republican Party since 1980. It's not enough to disagree over a policy issue or to present an opposing way to deal with an issue like healthcare. Donald Trump's president for 4 years, kept promising, I'm going to come up with a better healthcare plan than Barack Obama produced. He never produced one. The Republican Congress never produced a response to Obamacare. They don't deal with issues that way. They deal with this kind of performance of grievance and delegitimizing your opponent. So if you were to ask me today, what is the Republican policy agenda for the country, short of tax cuts, I'm not sure I would be able to answer that question. And I'm not trying to be flip about it. I just think that's where the party has gone.
There seems to be, and I got a great question from one of our listeners, there seems to be, related to this question, there seems to be sort of two Republican parties right now. There seems to be the one you're describing, and you've described in the book, that had its roots in 1980. But then we had this very interesting development in the 2020 election where this group called the Lincoln Project, basically Republicans came out and were fighting back, and ironically fighting for a Democratic nominee for president. And tell us about whether, what you think about the Lincoln Project, and are they going to be successful in steering the Republican Party to a more right of center, traditional conservative party or not?
I think the jury is out on that. It's probably too early to tell for sure. I'll tell you what, I'm not optimistic. And I say that believing firmly as a person who really cares about American politics, who likes to think I know something about American political history. We need two strong political parties in this country. We need two strong, responsible political parties, a right of center party and a left of center party. And once in a while, they need to try to come together in the middle and solve big national problems, like the Senate was able to do and the Democrats and Republicans were able to do in the 60s over civil rights and a whole host of other domestic policy issues. And even coming together, the two parties coming together, as Senator Church and Mark Hatfield and others did, John Sherman Cooper with Church, to try to end the war in Vietnam. But we don't really have that in the Republican Party these days. We don't have a party that is dedicated to trying to find a solution to national problems. So the question was, are some of these more efforts at more moderation in Republican circles going to have any legs? I think the jury's out on that. I'm not encouraged, though, when Senator McConnell, the day that Donald Trump is acquitted in his impeachment trial, issues an absolutely scathing speech on the floor of the United States Senate, essentially saying Trump is responsible for the January 6th riot, insurrectionist riot on the steps of the Capitol building, where people died, and the $30 million at least in damage was done to the citadel of American government. He blasts him for that and says he's personally responsible. And then yesterday he's on Fox News saying, well, if Trump is the nominee in 2024, I'll support him. So how do you reconcile those 2 points of view? I can't. It's impossible. So do I have faith? Well, I don't know. One thing that really disturbs me, frankly, and really worries me, is this level of radicalization is really going down to the grassroots of the party. And that's being manifest in things like the Oregon legislature in the state that I live, that the Republican leaders, all the Republicans in the Oregon Senate walked out yesterday over a dispute with the governor over a response to the pandemic. It wasn't even a piece of legislation they were disagreeing about. It was a disagreement with the Democratic governor over how to approach pandemic issues. And they walked out, shutting down the legislature for the rest of the week by refusing to show up and be part of a quorum. So I don't know what you call that. It's not politics. It sure as heck is radical.
We seem to have two Republican parties in Idaho too, that, everybody's suing each other. The legislature's now telling state agencies not to get opinions from the Republican Attorney General. Anyway, it seems to be going on in here as well.
Yeah, I honest to gosh, in 40 plus years of being involved and watching and participating in Idaho politics, I would never have thought that the two members of Congress from Idaho would endorse an effort to overturn a free and fair presidential election, as Mike Simpson and Russ Fulcher did by signing on to that phony lawsuit brought by the Texas Attorney General. But that's the level of the Republican response to things these days, and it's really surprising that, I think of a guy like Lawrence Wasden, who I've known for years, as being a very conservative Republican, who I would say has done a pretty decent workmanlike job of being Attorney General of Idaho. C. Sanders had a good relationship with him on nuclear waste issues, although they didn't see everything eye to eye for sure. But to have him, be the victim now of his own party in the legislature trying to go after him and his ability to provide legal services to state agencies, it's just, it's a level of party dysfunction and infighting that is really kind of amazing.
So Mark, I know we're running short on time. We could be talking all day about this, but there are a couple of really great questions I wanted that folks have suggested. One is, what do you think now as an Oregonian? We need to bring you back to Idaho, by the way. But I understand, I've been to your place in Oregon, so I understand why you're there. But one question is, do you think this proposal to add Eastern Oregon and Southern Oregon to Idaho will succeed? I sure hope I know the answer to that, but what do you think about that?
It will not succeed. And again, it's part of, to be honest with you, it's part of this performative politics of the conservative right these days. They're trying to make a statement by pushing something that will never happen. The only way it could possibly happen would be an act of Congress, and that's just not going to happen. So it's, it's a manufactured issue, stir people up, get a bunch of headlines, allow a bunch of conservative activists to make hot sounding speeches about it, and it's not going to go anywhere.
The second question here might be, the answer could be short. The listener wants to know if any of the players in NICPAC or any of these campaigns were like Lee Atwater and expressed any regret for the role they played in this story, especially since some of them are called rhinos now.
No, I found no real evidence of any expression of regret on the part of Dolan, who, pretty quickly after 1980 went into eclipse. By 1982, NICPAC was trying to run similar kinds of campaigns against a number of other Democratic incumbents who were up in 1982, Paul Sarbanes in Maryland and John Melcher in Montana, among others. And those campaigns, for a variety of reasons, never got off the ground. But and Dolan, it's not a big part of the story that I tell, but it's not an insignificant part. He was a deeply closeted gay man, homosexual, and he kept that very much private. And even people that knew him very well at the time of his death in 1986 were surprised, and many of them disbelieving that he had that kind of lifestyle. and I'm not passing any judgment on that. I'm just saying that he was a complicated figure at a time when it must have been extraordinarily difficult to be a gay man and be involved in deeply Republican politics, particularly when you're working with a guy like Jesse Helms, who made it a part of his entire persona to, engage in gay bashing. If you're hearing all that rain, it's beating on my windows here.
Oh, wow. That's why you need to move back to Idaho. It's really nice here today.
So no, none of them really expressed any regret about it or remorse at all.
So one more question, because I think I can combine these. Two listeners. One wants to know, there's a rumor, there's a belief that the intelligence community played a role in trying to defeat Church as revenge for his investigation. And the other person is asking, what was the role of Senator Jim Mcclure in the 1980 race? The reason I kind of combine those is because there's a great anecdote. Actually, I was literally there that day, the day in Genesee when the anecdote that you put in the book. So tell us about that, the role of the intelligence, and tell us about the role of Jim Mcclure in the race.
Well, the Intelligence Committee investigation, as I indicated earlier, is one of, in my judgment, is one of the high points of Frank Church's political career. We would not, as American citizens, as taxpayers, have nearly the knowledge about actions undertaken in our name by our own government in the intelligence community had it not been for Frank Church's investigation. There's just no question that a lot of that material, which members of the Senate for years in some cases, Mike Mansfield, for example, have been trying to get more light cast upon that aspect of American foreign policy. That would not have happened without Church's investigation. So just say that at the outset. Were people upset about it? Sure. And did the new right and some Republicans, including Senator Mcclure, seize on it as an issue? Absolutely. Did the intelligence community sort of conspire to help defeat Church? I don't know. There's anecdotal evidence of different things that were leaked and that sort of thing, but I don't think that was nearly as impactful as the crescendo of criticism that basically boiled down to Church had exposed things that should have been left in the closet, so to speak, been left alone, that he had in fact contributed to a diminishment of national security, which I think is total bunk, but nonetheless the charge was made. So the incident you reference is Sims is campaigning in North Idaho. ABC television crew is following him around. He's campaigning with Senator Mcclure, and Church is caught on an open mic. He's wearing a microphone.
Sims.
I'm sorry, Sims is caught on a microphone, prompting a member of the audience to ask Mcclure that question. Did Church weaken national security by his investigation of the intelligence agencies? And McClure's response was devious and nasty, I think, in saying that, well, he had been told that a CIA officer had died as a result of having his name exposed by the Church committee. Well, it's just an absolutely ludicrous charge. Never happened. The Church committee was largely devoid, and some of the people on this call know it better than I, largely devoid of leaks to the press. They did a marvelous job of conducting the investigation without a lot of leaking. But the allegation was made, and when another United States senator says of a colleague that, in essence, this guy was responsible for the death of a CIA officer, and it became a story nationally and in Idaho, then it has some impact. But again, I just underscore, and I'm repeating myself, but God bless Frank Church and the investigation of the CIA. We would not know 1/10 of what we know today about the history of the national foreign policy had he not conducted that investigation.
Yeah, a couple of things. It's very unusual for a sitting U.S. senator to oppose another sitting senator from the same state because there's no competition there. They're never going to run against each other. So there's
Right.
nothing to really be gained. Secondly, church made a point of never wanting to know the specific names of any officer. So he could have never, or his staff could have never leaked that, because that was one of his cardinal rules. We don't want any names. I'm going to invite anyone who wants to leave, but I do want to ask one last question, Mark. I keep saying that, but we keep going. But this is actually coming from one of our listeners, so I want to try to get it in. How do you think that, let me make sure I can get this right. What is the anecdote? And yeah, what can we do? To describe the radicalization of the Republican Party and demonize the Democrats, what can be done about this, our politics? Can we bring it back from this brink?
Well, we're going to find out in pretty short order, I think. And if I put on I'm usually a pessimist about things. Pessimists are usually not disappointed. But I'm going to put on my optimist hat for a moment and say that the approach that Joe Biden is bringing to the presidency after the tumultuous, chaotic, incompetent 4 years of Donald Trump is the antidote to the radicalization of the Republican Party. So if he can bring back to the presidency, which he already has in many respects, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of competency, bring down the tone of the animosity in the country, to be the basic decent guy that I believe he is, then that's the antidote to the craziness that comes from, frankly, people like the Matt Getzes and the Jim Jordans of the world on the right. Get back, and the challenge for Democrats, I think, is to provide that kind of an environment, to operate in that kind of environment, insist on that kind of environment, and then deal with substantive issues. And that's clearly what Biden is trying to do, to deal with the reality of the pandemic and how to get vaccine out there as quickly as possible for people, how to reassure the American public that, the science is suitable to, get your shot, and bring that level of competence back to government. Then that's the antidote to the craziness of the last 4 years, and in many respects, the last 40 years.
Well, Mark, I could keep asking you questions because I keep getting them. I do want to just say that on behalf of the Frank Church Institute, I want to thank you for joining us today. And I think there's going to be an opportunity for those who maybe didn't get their questions in. Mark and I will be discussing this, I think, later in March as well, just to put a plug in on that. Like I said, we could go all day, but I know that you probably want to start working on your other new book. I don't know if you want to tell our listeners about that. It might be bad luck, but I will say Mark's starting to work on a new compelling book. But I guess we'll get to that one when it's done.
Well, thank you, Rod. This has been really great, and what a great pleasure it is to visit with you about these distant memories of 1980, and when you and I were green behind the ears as reporters. You were always better at it than I was.
Not so.
We shared some of those experiences, and I think in many ways probably shaped our outlook about politics as a result of that enduringly important 1980 election. So it's really, really great to be with you, and on your birthday too.
Thanks, Mark. And
I would just,
thanks.
if I can put in a plug,
Yep.
The book is available directly from the publisher. Rediscovered Books in Boise has copies on hand. I'm going to be doing an event with Rod for Rediscovered Books on March 23rd. I'm doing a City Club of Boise program next week, actually, March 2nd. So there'll be other opportunities to hear me pontificate about 1980 and Republican politics. But if you're interested in the book, I would encourage you to get it from a local independent bookstore if you can.
And I highly recommend it. It's a great read, and you'll learn a lot about Idaho politics and national politics in it. Well, Mark, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for being with us for Fridays with Frank, and have a great day.
Thanks, Rod.
Bye, Mark.